Everybody, welcome back to the show. Cameron English here with you, Director of Biosciences at ACSH, joined again by my intrepid colleague, Dr. Josh Bloom, Director of Chemical and Pharmaceutical Sciences. Dr. Bloom, how are you doing this lovely afternoon?
I am well, thank you, Cameron. And that's probably the last polite thing you're going to hear for an hour.
That's okay. We're talking about at least one organization that, frankly, I don't think deserves politeness, and we'll get into them in just a second. But we've got two stories today. The first one deals with the possibility that there are obesogenic chemicals out there in the environment, in your food, in consumer products that you use every day. So the theory is that exposure to these chemicals increases the likelihood that you're going to gain weight and become obese. You can imagine what we think of that already. And then we're going to move on to a story that Josh wrote about getting a COVID booster specifically for the Omicron variant or some of its subvariants. Interesting stuff. I think it's perennially important topics. This first one, Josh, is a story that I wrote just a few days ago, and it's entitled "The Obesogen Myth: Chemicals Don't Cause Weight Gain." And this is me responding to a blog post published by our friends at the Environmental Working Group, who I'm just going to call EWG because that name is long and annoying to say. But the idea is, as I alluded to a minute ago, there are chemicals in the environment, BPA, PFAS, all the scary acronyms everyone's been exposed to. These chemicals, in one way or another, they exert some metabolic influence. They cause inflammation. They cause DNA methylation. They do something at the cellular level that increases the likelihood that you're going to gain weight. And I start with a little bit of background. So EWG, as Josh well knows, because he's been criticizing them much longer than I have, they're wrong about the dangers of pesticides. They're wrong about the environmental impacts of eating meat. They're wrong about cell phone radiation. They're wrong about contaminants in drinking water. They're wrong about antibiotics in the food supply. And the list goes on and on and on and on. The number of health scares that they have either created or helped perpetuate, it's unending. And the story is always the same. There's some chemical, there's some exposure that you're around that causes harm, and there's an evil corporation doing it, and the government isn't doing enough to protect you from it. And the answer, as always, is lots of regulation and lots of scaremongering. It's the same. The narrative's the same over and over. And they do that here. So I think it was important to set up and say they're wrong about everything. So before I go any further, Josh, do you have any preliminary comments on this idea?
Well, Cameron, you can substitute for obesity and put in cancer, fertility, IQ, sperm count. By the way, that's hard to do. I'm just saying, because you have to really be good at counting. It doesn't matter. It could be athlete's foot or bunions. They will never run out of potential harms. They'll never run out of chemicals. And they'll never run out of the same old story that they use to indict these chemicals. And it's always the same. They take a mouse and let's say they paint a bullet on with BPA and they fire it into the mouse. The mouse dies. So then they get a grant to study BPA, which has been studied more than any chemical in the history of the world. But, that I'm exaggerating just a little bit. But what they do is they do cellular experiments and they bathe some cell type or another in ridiculous amounts of a chemical and look for any effect. And, you'll find something for most chemicals at a high enough concentration. And supposedly this has some relevance to the detection of the same chemical in humans. And then they'll do a crap epidemiological study, which suggests that people who are exposed to this have antlers or whatever they're pushing that week. And it's the same old story time after time.
It's terrible almost always. Almost always in this field of it's known as risk factor epidemiology, where you're looking for the very tiny effects from very specific exposures. So you're not even saying this exposure definitely causes this disease by itself. You're saying it exerts some influence on the development of this condition. So even if it is legitimate, you're looking at very tiny effects. I think that's important to keep in mind. One other thing, most people don't know this. Josh, you know this very well, but when you're doing these sort of in vitro experiments, these cell culture studies, you're usually working with what are called immortalized cell lines, which means they're already screwed up, right? In many cases, I believe they're already cancerous. Because
they're cancer cells.
Yeah, you need cells that will continually divide, so you can throw all sorts of chemicals at them and experiment on them in these really dramatic ways that you can't do with people or animals even. And so it's important to stress that even if you find an effect under those conditions, it's not necessarily, and Josh was alluding to this with his bullet example, BP on a bullet or whatever. Finding an effect under those circumstances does not mean that the chemical is dangerous, because you're already dealing with a cell line that's already damaged. So it's not going to function like the same cell would in your body, right? For one thing, it's connected to everything else that makes you up, but it's already damaged and dysfunctional. So that's one thing I would say. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a bunch. The first is that if you notice these studies where they're looking at trace chemicals, it's virtually almost always in the urine rather than the blood. So what does this mean? Well, it means two things. It means that the fact that it's in the urine means your body is disposing of it properly by way of the liver and kidneys. And it's easily detected in urine using modern instrumentation at ridiculously low concentrations. So I would absolutely guarantee that if you go back 3 decades when you couldn't measure parts per trillion, the same chemicals are there, they just couldn't be seen. So it's a double nothing, really, in addition to all the limitations that you rattled off before. Let me ask a more fundamental question. Why are environmental groups who are supposed to be saving birds and fish and a lot of the wonderful things that these guys do, why are they in the business of chemistry and medicine at all? What does a little bit of a plasticizer in your urine have to do with the environment? The answer is nothing. And so you need to ask, well, why are they studying these same chemicals over and over again in medical studies? So they not only don't know anything about chemistry, they probably don't know much about medicine either. Yet this is the group that's putting out studies. So why? Well, you tell me.
I would be happy to. In years past, I was a little more reserved, and I would maybe operate with kid gloves, and I'd say I can't know what's in people's heads. But I'm pretty confident in saying now that these groups just exist to fundraise. They, as I alluded to at the top, they have a business model, which is really what it is, that they use to scare the public and to gin up support from politicians and from federal agencies in some cases. And they raise money, and they do this over and over. And the reason they do it with these chemical issues, like Josh was mentioning, is because people are scared of these things. I think as much as most people don't want to admit it, we really don't care all that much about some obscure species of, fish or whatever animal you can think of, some gopher or something. We really don't care all that much because we have lives to live and kids to raise and jobs to perform and so on and so forth. And so the reason they turn to BPA and they turn to these other things is because they can scare you. You know, you may not know that much about one of these random animals that we're talking about, but you know, you use receipt paper every day, and you use plastics every day, and you eat food every day. So if they can keep you scared about this, you know, they're going to be in business forever. I think that's what it comes down to. And it might make some people mad that we say that. I think it's true. But let's get into some of the specifics of this blog post from EWG, by the way, which was called "Are Food and Consumer Product Chemicals Contributing to Our Obesity Crisis?" ? The answer is no. But here's a couple of the claims that they make. So they say the food industry insists that America's obesity crisis can be chalked up to simple math. People eat too much and exercise too little. So there's a little bit to say here. First, no one I know takes that simplistic of an understanding. Can you find some food lobbyist somewhere that says that? Probably, but who cares? That's not really what determines the valid sides in the debate. What most people will say that work in nutrition, or they do some kind of research with human metabolism, is they will say it's more complicated than simple math. What you eat influences how much you burn. And there's all kinds of different feedback mechanisms in play here. So no one says, well, just starve yourself and you'll lose weight, because your body will engage some compensating factors for that, because we're just learning more about metabolism, and that seems to be the case. Nonetheless, it's undeniable that if you do go on a diet and you do exercise, you will lose weight. This has just been shown over and over again. People do it on different diets. Sometimes they have to tweak their approach. Sometimes eating certain foods works for them. Eating other foods doesn't. Maybe they have to exercise more. Maybe they have to tweak something that's unique to them. That's true. And maybe they'll lose differing amounts of weight. But what really isn't in question is that weight loss follows caloric restriction and exercise. And it's annoying to me that they do this, because people who say this, who say, oh, it's not just eat less, move more. The reason they go to that talking point is because they have a book to sell. They have a diet they want you to follow, or they have a chemical they want you to be scared of. And it doesn't follow necessarily from the fact that we don't perfectly understand human metabolism, that they have the secret sauce. They have the key that explains why people can't lose weight and explains why so many people keep gaining weight. And it drives me nuts, Josh. What are your thoughts?
Let me ask you another question designed to infuriate people. Who benefits from these chemical scares, aside from the organizations themselves?
Oh, the answers are myriad. Of course, trial lawyers who can sue the manufacturers, who can sue the businesses that use the products that the manufacturers make. Federal agencies benefit, because then there's lots of regulatory research and work for them to do. Politicians benefit from it, because then they can claim to have exposed the problem and committed billions of dollars to combating it. So basically all of, and again, I'm getting a little saucy here this afternoon, Josh. All of the worst people in the world benefit from these scares.
Just my opinion, but I think you missed the major culprit.
Who's that?
Organic food industry.
Well, how do they benefit? Because organic food comes in plastic too, right?
Well, I wrote a really obnoxious critique of the, as hard as that is to imagine, of the marketing techniques used in Whole Foods. I was going up and down the aisle with my camera, snapping one lie and one half-truth after another. And basically, you got a bunch of knuckleheads walking around thinking that they're going to live 700 years because they're not eating any chemicals, because the Whole Foods has no chemicals in it. No preservatives, no growth hormones, no thises, no that's, no plasticizers. Now, I'm not an investigative reporter, but I've just got a pretty good hunch that if you were to really take a look at the funding of groups like EWG and NRDC, you're going to find a lot of it is going to come from big companies in the organic industry, because they have people suckered into believing that organic means chemical free. You can deny that until you're blue in the face, but it still works.
That's certainly true. And in EWG's case, they come out and say, and I don't know if it's still the case, but for years they just got a lot of money from the organic food industry. And so they got in front of it and they said, hey, we're happy to partner with Stonyfield and Whole Foods and Nature Valley and all these different companies that have a vested interest in selling organic, quote unquote, products. So that's true. That's true. I think maybe that's part of the overall narrative they're trying to sell, is this natural, wholesome sort of lifestyle worldview. And in that sense, you're right. It's all bogus. Now let's get into some of the specifics. To the extent that they talk about any science whatsoever in this blog post, they link to a massive review that was published earlier this year. And it was long. I read a good chunk of it. I couldn't read all of it. It was thousands and thousands of words, probably a small book worth of material. But it's basically a team of researchers documenting the possible mechanisms and all the epidemiological studies have been done, all the animal studies. And so they're trying to summarize all this literature, and EWG links to it and doesn't really discuss what's in it. But they say this. So this is the blog post. They say, can chemicals found in everything from food and cosmetics to drugs and carpets make it easier for our bodies to build fat? Many of these chemicals, called obesogens by scientists, alter hormones and metabolism in subtle ways that ultimately make us gain more weight. So that's a reasonable summary of the hypothesis. But if you look at this review, and I encourage everyone to do this, if you ever read or you're looking at a peer-reviewed study, go look at the discussion section or the limitations section, because this is where the come to Jesus comments are. If researchers have integrity, this is where they tell you the limitations of their work, or at least some of them. And oftentimes they're very, very big, and to the point that they might actually undermine the conclusion of the paper that you just read. And in this review, the authors had the integrity to do this. And so here's some of the examples that I pulled out. They talk about the possibility of reverse causality. They talk about trying to separate one chemical's influence from another, because in many instances, you're exposed to a lot of these chemicals at the same time. And because they're in such small quantities, it's hard to discern what effect might be caused by what chemical. There's really no way to know that in an epidemiological study. But even if you're trying to find a mechanism, you can't figure out the mechanism if you're looking at 5 chemicals, because they might all operate differently. Josh, as the chemist, you can speak to this too in just a minute. And then, of course, as I just alluded to, very low environmental exposure, right? And we have a toxicologist that writes at ACSH named Susan Goldhaber. She's pointed this out ad nauseum about BPA. You're just exposed to so little of it that the kind of studies that they're doing where they're drowning rats in it doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't prove anything or demonstrate anything about the chemical. And then maybe most importantly is mechanism. This review, they posited all kinds of possibilities. One that they spend a lot of time on is DNA methylation, which is an epigenetic component to this. But the idea is basically there are some changes that you experience at the cellular level when you're exposed to these chemicals. It doesn't permanently alter your DNA, but it might alter gene expression in some way, in a way that encourages you to produce more fat cells or to store more fat, right? You partition it in your gut, for example. And it's through these sorts of mechanisms. Sometimes it's inflammation. Sometimes it's, it has some effect on one of your hormones like insulin. And this is the mechanism by which these chemicals may, and I emphasize may, have the impacts here. But the review was very clear in that we don't know this for certain. We need to do better studies always, right? We need better studies, give us more money so we can do more studies. But EWG doesn't mention any of this. They just say, oh, here's this big review and here's what these scientists say, but they don't talk about any of the limitations.
You actually just taught me something, because when I was ripping up EWG and NRDC articles about BPA, bisphenol A, it was on the hook then because it was an estrogen mimic. So therefore, That's why guys are wearing D-cup bras and all this other stuff. And the trouble is, if you look at BPA, well, there are two troubles. First of all, BPA has it's a classification of organic chemicals called phenols, and phenols make terrible drugs because they're rapidly metabolized by a water solubilizing enzyme and dumped right into the urine. So they're measuring chemical that's been processed. It's not in your body. It's going in the toilet. And then the second problem with the fertility and sexual hormones is if you look at the binding constants of BPA versus some of the estrogens, I don't know, thousands or millions of times less. So even if you had BPA floating around, let's just say suitable amounts to possibly affect some kind of biological process, it wouldn't even compete with the natural ligand estradiol for the estrogen hormones because it's such a weak binder. So they don't say this, of course. And the other thing I've learned is that if you've got a really bad paper, it's going to be really long. And it's going to have all kinds of superfluous junk in it, all kinds of possible mechanism that makes them look like they know molecular biology and biochemistry. And no one will read it. And there you go. So they can make claims on this. And who's going to bother reading 10 pages of gibberish about something which is all made up or at best theoretical?
That's not hyperbole on Josh's part, by the way, regarding the peer-reviewed material that's out there. There's been, interestingly enough, there's been peer-reviewed studies that look at how many people actually read the literature that gets published in all these journals. And there's thousands upon thousands in the various fields of science today. And most of them are never read, or, maybe in some cases, the reviewer might give it a cursory glance before they they stamp it for publication. And this is different when it's groundbreaking research or when it's a real study. People will look at those, but a lot of these papers that get published, nobody reads them, and they exist. And then groups like EWG can go, "Hey, look at the study we found. We know how to use PubMed. Here, take a look." But no one actually reads the content. And that's what we do. That's why it was helpful for me to take a look at this, because I could just say, well, these researchers are admitting that it could just be that for whatever reason, overweight people have slightly higher exposure to BPA. It might not be the BPA is what's contributing to their obesity. So just a simple mix-up of cause and effect like that, or just an association, it undermines the whole case. And they don't talk about this. There's another thing that drives me nuts. I mentioned this briefly up above, but EWG says the number of people who have overweight and obesity in the U.S. and globally continues to climb, despite our cultural obsession with diet and exercise and the myriad efforts to promote healthier diets. Blah, blah, blah. Since the 1970s, we're all getting fatter and fatter. And again, this may be true to a certain extent, but it doesn't follow that your idiosyncratic explanation of that phenomenon is correct. And it always drives me nuts. I remember like when the Atkins diet was the thing back in the early 2000s, and even today it still has a pretty big following. But any diet, there's like a core of true believers. They want you to be vegan, or they want you to be keto or low carb or whatever. They always say this. They go, look, obesity is exploding, even though, people are obsessed with trying to lose weight. And that must mean that my special diet is correct. And that's not the case. At most, what that says is, losing weight is difficult, and we're not quite sure how to get people to lose weight at the population level. That's all you can infer from a statement like that. But yet they use this to point to say, well, therefore it must be obesogenic chemicals.
Well, let me debunk that right away. Okay, so we've been getting fatter and fatter since the 70s, right? How long has BPA been used in plastics? Maybe since the 50s or 60s. And all of a sudden, in the last 10 or 20 years, it magically is going to make people obese when they've been chowing down on it all along. Makes zero sense. The whole argument's a big crock of BPA.
Okay, final thing before we move on to your booster story, Josh. Every story like this, every blog post, whatever, there's always a comment like this. So EWG says, Congress should provide more funding to agencies like the EPA and the FDA to review obesogens' health impacts and close the loopholes that allow chemical companies, not the FDA, to decide which chemicals in food and cosmetics are safe. It's 2 sentences and it's full of lies. It's just so outrageous that they get away with saying these things. So first of all, it's technically true that cosmetics manufacturers can develop products and then put them on the market without getting the FDA's blessing. That's true. However, what most people don't know is that if that product goes on the market and it's in violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, which is the law that gives the FDA most of its regulatory authority, if there's any violation of that law, then the FDA can seize the products, it can sue the manufacturer, and it can take a handful of other regulatory actions that are very, very expensive and, of course, would destroy the company's reputation. So the idea that you have these cosmetics companies out there just willy-nilly putting poisonous, dangerous products on the market is just foolish. It's sort of like if you lived in a mob-controlled neighborhood back in the day and they came into your store and they're like, hey, you're going to need our protection, man. We don't know what's going to happen in this neighborhood unless you pay us to keep you safe, right? You're not technically required to pay the mob for protection, but if you don't, the chances that you show up the next day and your store's destroyed go up significantly. And it's a similar situation with federal regulation in that, technically you don't have to go to the FDA and say, would you please, can we use this product? But they have authority on the back end to regulate what you do. And whether that's a good thing or not, I don't know. I think that's a discussion for another podcast episode. But my point here is that we're not dealing with helpless regulators who are at the mercy of our corporate overlords who really run the show, at least not in the sense that EWG is talking about here. It's just foolish. And then one other thing I'll say before, Josh, you can jump in here if you want. When it comes to food chemicals, the FDA actually does have regulatory authority on the front end. So they mandate that these companies submit studies that allow the regulatory agency to very thoroughly review if the chemical is safe before it goes. They're called food contact chemicals. If you're not familiar with that phraseology, everyone out there listening. But the FDA is allowed to say, okay, this is, we're confident, there's reasonable certainty that this isn't going to cause any harm. So, okay, you can put it in your products at this point. So all that to say, the federal government has enormous regulatory authority. The power that they have over your daily lives, from the kinds of foods you can buy to the kinds of cigarettes you can smoke to the kinds of animals that farmers can breed for commercial production. It's so expansive. It's preposterous for EWG to even posit that the FDA is just helpless here. That's nonsense.
Well, let me just ask one question to sum this up, Cameron. Does anybody in his right mind really believe that eyeliner is going to make you fat? Like, come on, you idiots. Shut up. Just shut up.
I think we're going to put that on the front end of the show. It'll be the first thing that people hear is Josh just shouting "shut up" into the microphone. I think it sums everything up, because really, when you think about it, that's exactly what they're trying to say is the spare enchiladas that you have from last night, when you put those in a plastic container in your fridge, that it's not the it's not the extra enchiladas you ate, it's the plastic that you put them in. And it's not the fact that you don't go to the gym as much as you should. It's it's the plastic bag that your Doritos came in. I just don't know. It is really silly when you put it in that simple of terms, Josh. Good insight there. Way to go, man. I appreciate that.
It's all money, my friend. That's bottom line is money and useful idiots, and there's your movement.
We'll have to on another episode. We'll have to talk about a school of economics that deals with incentives called public choice theory. And it's for another day. But basically, it says that regulatory agencies, people working in federal bureaucracies or working in governments, they have the same incentives that people in the private marketplace do. And I think that helps explain a lot of the behavior we're talking about. But that's for another day. Josh, let's talk about Omicron and one of its million subvariants and whether or not a booster makes sense in this case. So tell us about this story you wrote.
People can ignore COVID, and everybody's tired of it. And I don't remember the last time I wore a mask. But that doesn't mean it's gone. Because this damn thing, for reasons having to do with its RNA makeup, mutates like crazy. And the important mutations are all on the spike, which is attached to the receptor on human cells. And variations in this spike have made it more dangerous, more contagious. In fact, if you go back to the very first variant, Alpha, it was more contagious than the original Wuhan strain. And then really every single variant and now subvariants that follow are a lot more contagious than the one before. And you can see this because once one of these new ones shows up, very quickly it crowds out all the other ones when they do sequencing of hundreds of thousands of samples. You can see that original Omicron is long gone. The first couple of subvariants, they're gone too. And now we have a new one called BA.5, which is all over the place now. So the other disturbing thing about BA.5, and by the way, if there's not a BA.6 working its way through somebody's nose at this point in the world, like just life doesn't make any sense. But BA.5 is especially obnoxious because, of course, it's more contagious than the other ones, and Omicron was way more contagious than anything that came before it. But also, it doesn't really care whether you've already had Omicron or not. So the immunity from, let's say, BA1 and 2 doesn't really prevent you from getting this new one, BA.5. In fact, you could conceivably get them at once, which would be a joyful experience, except that the BA.5's crowded all the other ones out, so I don't think the others are available to get. So, we still have a mess on our hands because the original vaccines worked fantastically against that strain, but they don't work as well as this thing continues to evolve. Doesn't mean you shouldn't get them, but they certainly don't prevent you from catching it anymore. And I think it's safe to say that they do prevent serious illness and deaths. I can't say exactly by how much, but probably not as much as the original vaccine did against the first strain. So vaccine makers have a real headache here, and the FDA does too, because there's no right answer. The question, which was was answered last week is, do we need a booster? And it's not really a booster because it's a modified vaccine against the Omicron variant. And the answer is, who knows? The main reason is, and the FDA advisory panel was split on this, that 19 people voted yes to come up with a modified vaccine. I'll call it a booster just to save time. Based on the BA.1, which was circulating, I don't know, earlier this year. On the two side that voted down, one was Paul Offit, who I know personally, and he's a former ACSH trustee. And let's just say I would be really uncomfortable being on the other side of a vote from Paul Offit when it comes to vaccines. So Offit argued that he would not support a BA.1 vaccine because it wasn't around anymore. And even if it was, it wouldn't really offer that much protection against what's going around now. So he said he would support a BA.5 vaccine, even though he readily admits that there's no evidence, there's no solid evidence that it's going to protect us any better. But it can be inferred just based on the original vaccine that it would. So the FDA goes with the 2 instead of the 19, and they say, fine, we're going to approve an appropriate booster for BA.5. Okay, that's great. So 6 months from now, this thing comes out if everything goes right. What's circulating now? Who knows? Is it an Omicron at all? The next letter is pi. Maybe there's a lot of pi floating around and the Omicron vaccine isn't going to be that effective. So what we're dealing with is educated guesses, and that's the absolute best that can be done. So the problem was pretty obvious. The virus is always well ahead of the vaccine that you would make to stop it. And I don't know what to do about this.
I don't think anybody does, but no one really wants to acknowledge that. There's just something, and I'm sure this is common in the public generally, but among scientists and regulators and politicians, everybody's really uncomfortable with uncertainty, even though we're drowning in it, which has always been frustrating, at least since the beginning of the pandemic. And one thing I wanted to ask you about, which you've written about previously, is this idea that, if all the stupid rubes would just put on their cloth masks and get all their shots and stay home, this thing would be over in 2 weeks. But that clearly wasn't the case. You can just look at the case rates and mortality in, say, a state like California, which was on the leading edge of all the COVID restrictions, compared to a Texas or a Florida or one of the Dakotas. I forget which one, but one of them basically just didn't do anything the whole time. And the numbers, when you adjust for age and population, they're not that different. So the argument that I believe you made several months ago, Josh, and maybe even last year at this point, was that viruses evolved to mutate. They evolved to spread. And so they're pretty good at evading the defenses we come up with in many cases. And we're just not comfortable saying that. There has to be a solution, even if it's a bad one, not necessarily because it's anybody's fault. It's just that sometimes we're not particularly great at keeping these things under control. And no one really wanted to say, there's some truth to that in this case. Do you still feel that way, or have you changed your perspective at all?
Even more so. I mean, we're dealing with something the likes of which the world has never seen before. This is a new virus. Fine, it's a coronavirus. There are other ones. It's a SARS virus. There was one other. But this is the first one that spreads like crazy from animals to humans and humans to humans and causes a whole lot of trouble in different organs in unexplainable ways between one person and another. There's an awful lot that's unknown. So I actually think the science of two plus years of even getting it down to this level where it's somewhat understood and that we do have some tools to treat it finally, it's been exceptional. Yet people, all they do is complain that, well, the CDC was wrong and the FDA is wrong. Well, you try doing it and see how easy it is.
It's not easy by any means. I think there are valid criticisms you could level at these different agencies at
Absolutely.
different points.
Yeah.
The whole like the COVID tracking map, the heat map, like they're updating it in real time where cases are increasing or decreasing. I think that sort of just adds to the hysteria again without there being a real valid solution. But talk a little bit about how these viruses mutate. And you say in the story, let me get this quote handy because I thought this appropriately summed it up. You said that it was like one mutation out of several thousand, right? It was like the number of amino acid changes. It was 1,273 amino acids in the spike. So I believe it was BA 0.5 and 0.4. They differed by 3 amino acids out of 1,273. And that was enough to make it more infectious and to start a new spread. Talk about that.
Well, science just can't handle this. Let me just back up and clear things up a bit. There are, I don't know, let's say about 20 variants of concern, some of which have just been dead ends and some of which have taken over the world. But there are billions and trillions of mutations out there, the vast majority of which just never end up with an infectious virus or a viable virus. So the real problem is the number of mutations of the spike in an RNA virus is huge. And just like if you roll the dice enough times, you're going to throw 12, 100 times in a row, just by sheer chance of huge numbers. These things keep self-selecting, and the ones that are fit and that are more contagious, they're the ones that come out of wherever. It doesn't even matter where they come from. So if you want people to start flinging themselves out windows, I could talk about why RNA viruses mutate so easily. I don't think you want that. But let's just say that there are mechanisms in DNA viruses, and herpes is an example, that keep down mutations. They tamp them down, they repair them, and these are not present to the extent in RNA viruses. And also RNA itself is considerably less stable than DNA. So this is the perfect storm for mutation, and now we're seeing it. And every few months, there's another one in the news. My fear is that that 5 or 10 variants down the line, it starts behaving differently or worse, or goes after your heart, or your brain, because there are receptors in every cell of your body that this thing can latch onto. So it's really the uncertainty of what's up next that concerns me the most. Fortunately, we do have one good drug called Paxlovid, and it works quite well in preventing serious disease, deaths, hospitalization, and it works independently of whatever the composition of the spike is. As long as that's around, there's a pretty good safety net. At some point, and I don't think we want to start this now, I should discuss how viruses can become resistant to drugs. And of course, this is evolution on a huge scale, and it's something we've seen before with AIDS. Just suffice it to say that right now, I would take the Omicron vaccine in the fall in a second. And I have a pack of Paxlovid that I tote around in case I test positive, because I have a couple of high-risk conditions that would make me want to take it if I became infected. So things aren't terrible yet, but they could be. And what disturbs me is there's an obvious lag in vaccine, so keeping up with the damn virus. But what there also is the absence of a pipeline of other antiviral drugs to treat this thing. And that's probably more disturbing to me as a former chemist. And I think we'll pay dearly for this at some point. But right now, we're still okay.
Well, that leads me to a final question as we wrap up here. You discussed briefly the fact that, at least initially, Omicron was seen as more infectious but less deadly. And that seems to be, it seems that there's a little bit of disagreement in the science community about this. A lot of people seem to think that, this is relative to, say, Delta. This is a lot less dangerous in terms of the likelihood that you're going to be hospitalized, that you're going to end up in a morgue. But then there seems to be people saying now, Omicron has, I don't know if it was hospitalized or killed, one of the two, but Omicron has severely harmed more people than Delta did in like half the time. I think that was the quote from the source you cited in your story. So where do you come down on that? Is this thing, for now at least, less dangerous than past variants we've been up against?
There's no way to tell. It could be less dangerous, but so much more contagious that more people are getting it, and then the death rates go up. Delta was the first really bad one. They're all really bad, but Delta was like a quantum leap. I would not write off Omicron as mild or harmless. It's bad enough.
All right. Well, there you have it. It's in progress. It's in real time. We're learning as we go. And maybe that's the best takeaway here, is that this is why we do science, is so we can try to understand viruses, for example, and figure out how we're gonna mitigate them in terms of public health. But thank you, as always, everyone, for joining us. I hope you're getting a lot out of this. I get a lot out of talking to Josh and Chuck, because they're just so damn smart and so insightful. And in Josh's case, especially charming and good looking. So that's always great. That was always great. Josh, thank you again for joining me.
There were 3 lies in that last sentence, Cameron, but I'm going to just let it go.
Well, we'll leave it to the audience to guess which ones were the lies.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you all for joining us. If you want to get these stories we're talking about, you go to our website, acsh.org. There's a subscribe tab up at the top. Click on that, punch in your email address. 3 times a week, we will send you our dispatch newsletter that contains all the stories that we publish every week. And at the end of the week, we look at the ones that you folks read the most. And then we talk about it and we try to get more in depth, as we have here today with the 2 stories we've talked about. So keep subscribing to the newsletter. Keep subscribing and listening to the show. We really appreciate it. It helps us get science-based messaging out to the world. And with that done, we will see you all next week.